So Demon Hunter was just nerfed, and it's time to figure out what the best decks in the game are. So without further ado, let's just jump into it. The first one, in my opinion, is Revolve Shaman. I think it's a deck that was very heavily punished by Soul Demon Hunter and Aggro Demon Hunter, just by how fast they were, and considering the fact that they are no longer as viable and as fast, that just means Evolve Shaman is getting an inherent, giant boost, in my opinion. I think that Evolve Shaman was already super strong, and if you could high roll, it could already beat those bad matchups. But now, you can get even just medium rolls and beat most matchups. Shaman's a very, very, very powerful class, and yes, you'll sometimes lose to bad RNG. Sometimes your Knuckles will evolve into something terrible, but it doesn't really matter because most of the time, just getting a ton of extra stats on the board, even if they're not super great, is enough to win. There's another version of this deck that runs Sea Giants instead of the Novice Engineers. I just like Novice Engineer because it makes drawing the Knuckles a little bit more consistent. It gives me something to play earlier, but the Sea Giant build is definitely very, very good as well, and you can run either one of them. And yeah, that's it. Let's jump into number 2. So number 2 is Pure Paladin. There are a couple of different versions of this build. This is the one that I run. And to be honest, I think that it's pretty solid. It has pretty decent tempo at the beginning of the game, and it has okay late game as well because you're able to generate resources with 2 Lightforge Crusaders. I used to only have 1, but since I think the meta is going to slow down, I think having a second one is pretty useful. Obviously, Lady Liadrin, the Yrils, and 2 Librams of Hope. Not to mention the fact that you can get more Librams of Hope. It still continues to be aggro decks because you're able to heal and put up really big Divine Shield taunt minions. It's able to beat slower decks if you are able to be more aggressive. I will say, though, that this is one of those decks that, since it's so popular and has such a high win rate, this, along with Evolve Shaman, I think will suffer the most in the next week. Because I think people are going to start trying to figure out how to beat these decks. And right now, everything's thrown in the air, oh my goodness, what do we do? And Demon Hunter's nerfed, let's just start experimenting. And these 2 already really good decks are rising. But as people learn to try to counter those 2 decks, their win rate will fall. And they'll still be super strong, and they're relatively cheap. So I would recommend building them if you can. But just realize that these are going to have slightly inflated win rates for the first week or so. And they'll fall back down to just normal strong. Next is Combo Miracle Rogue, and I think that this is the deck that probably will stay a higher win rate for the longest because it's super duper strong. The reason why I put it at number 3, though, behind the other ones, is because it's a lot harder to play than most of the other decks that are actually on this list. With Pure Paladin, it's just tempo. You just tempo things out, pump stuff up, play a couple of your late game cards to try to close out the game, and then you win, or sometimes you lose if they steal your minions or have good removal. And with Evolve Shaman, it's just play a few cards early game to get some tempo going, then get your weapon out, and then next turn, play Desert Hare with a Mogu Flesh Shaper as the 9-cost 3/4 rush minion, and maybe something else, and then just develop a huge board. And it's just very linear. But Combo Miracle Rogue is a lot harder to pull off because there's just so many decisions you have to make. There's so many cards you can play on any given turn. You have to figure out when to use what and on what. Should I use this preparation on this Eviscerate now just because I can? Or do I want to save it and hope to draw a Swindle later? Or do I want to use it to try to combo with Edwin or Questing Adventurer? And overall, it's just a very complicated deck that I think is very important to learn to play. And if you do learn to play, it will be one of the best decks in the game for you. So the next deck list that I think is going to be top tier is Ticketus Warlock, and let me explain. I do understand that Warlock, if you look here, is the 3rd weakest class in the game, but hear me out. Before the nerf, in just one day, this deck rose from 44% win rate to 46.7% win rate in just a day after the nerfs. And I only think it's going to get better as more people start playing slower decks and Ticketus is able to disrupt combos. And as aggro decks, people start to slowly drift away from them. So overall, I think that it's very important to realize that this is a deck that, even though it's not strong now, will be strong in the future. Mark my words, this deck is going to be a top 5, top 7 deck by the time the meta settles down, because it's going to be able to beat classes like Warrior and Mage and Priest by disrupting combos. It has really good minion removal, so it can deal with giant boards made by Druid and Evolve Shaman. It might struggle against Rogue a little bit, and aggro decks it does struggle against, but since they are a little bit weaker now, I think that it might have a slightly increased win rate even against its bad matchups. I'm really excited to see where this deck lands. It's got big minions, disruption, good removal, really good late game, and I expect this deck to be top 7, top 5 by the time everything settles. So next is Control Warrior. This is very similar to ETC Warrior. I've just focused on ETC Warrior a lot more in the past, and I think that this deck deserves credit. Both of their links will be in the description though. The reason why I like this deck is because it's more versatile in the sense that Bloodsworn Mercenary isn't specifically for an OTK. You can use it on things like Karagath, or a Taunt Minion, or Rattlegore, or to gain armor, and all of those things are good and viable. You're able to have combo disruption with things like Hecklebot and Acidic Swamp Ooze and Silas to steal minions or disrupt combos, which ETC Warrior isn't as able to do. And just in general, I think that it has better removal, and in the case of a lot of the matchups that you're going to be playing against, I feel like it'll do better. I think it'll do better into Shaman because it'll be able to more consistently remove giant evolved boards. I think it'll do a little bit worse than ETC into Paladin, but it'll still be fine if you can get a good brawl off, or you can steal one of their 8/8s. I think it'll do better into Hunter and Demon Hunter because those classes were both nerfed, and this class already did good against them in general. Rogue, similar to Paladin, I think it's not quite as good because you don't have a proactive way of winning, but if you get a good brawl and kill off a giant Edwin and set them back, you can very likely win that matchup as well. I'm positive into Rogue with this deck personally. Warrior mirror matches, you have ways of thinning out their deck and maybe killing off the ETC by, stealing Hecklebot. You also have Silas to steal Rattlegore. You will struggle against Mage, Warlock, and Priest, but if you look here, they are 3 of the worst classes in the game. This is just Ticketus can burn a lot of your cards, and then Mage and Priest, their RNG is just so unpredictable that you can't really do anything about it. And then Druid, you should be able to beat as well. So most of the classes are good matchups with this deck. You gain enough armor to survive some OTKs as well, actually, which is pretty cool. And overall, I think this deck is really, really good. So the next powerful deck list is actually going to be Big Druid, and the reason I think this deck is going to be good, even though Druid is the weakest deck or class in the game right now, is because as aggro goes down, this slower style of ramp will go up, and if that happens, then you're able to develop a board more consistently. You're able to get out multiple giant boards of Carnival Clowns. You have good draw. You have good armor. So the aggro decks that you would have played normally are going to be weaker, so you will more consistently beat those. This deck already didn't do that bad into several of these slower decks, and overall, I think this deck has always had potential. Like currently with this deck before the nerf, I was 6-3 with this deck, and I was 3-1 with it last season. So overall, 9-4. It's a small sample size, but it shows that there's potential. And with some of its worst matchups being nerfed, literally 3 of my 4 losses are against aggro Demon Hunter. So with that being the case, with its worst matchups being nerfed, and some of its better matchups probably seeing a rise in popularity, this is another more prediction deck that I think will get strong as time goes on. Also, it's really cheap because you only really need 2 legendaries. It's not like really cheap, but it's cheaper than a lot of other decks out there, so it's a pretty safe craft in my opinion. So even though this deck got nerfed pretty decently with the Blade Dance and the Shard Mystic each being 1 cost more, ultimately, I don't think that that's going to affect the win rate of this deck drastically. I think it will go down, and it'll go from like S tier to like middle of the pack A tier, but I think that after people start learning what the meta is and teching this deck around certain classes, I think that this deck will once again become very powerful. Because if you think about it, Blade Dance is still free off of Skull of Gul'dan. Shard Shatter Mystic being 4 isn't that big of a deal if aggro decks are being played less consistently anyway, because Voracious Reader was nerfed, aggro Demon Hunter was nerfed, and Highlander Hunter was nerfed. So the Shard Shatter Mystic doesn't affect it too much right now. You still technically have the same amount of burst and really good value minions like Bladed Lady and Skull of Gul'dan to increase your value as well. And even though Blade Dance will come into effect a couple of times where you'll be like, darn, if only I had one more mana, I could wipe the board, I don't think that it will be that game-changing that often. Like, I think the win rate of this deck will drop like a couple percent, but not anymore. And once people learn where the meta is and how everything balances out, I think that this deck will once again rise in popularity and power again, because it's still able to do pretty much everything. And I'm very excited to play this deck again and see how strong it is after the nerfs, and see if my prediction is right about this deck remaining really, really strong. And last thing, I'm not putting OTK Demon Hunter on here because even though I think it's strong, I think it does the worst against decks that are able to get some big minions out and kill you relatively quickly. And this is mostly Rogue with Edwin and Questing Adventurers, Paladin with giant minions that are sometimes pumped, and Evolve Shaman. And those are the 3 top decks I think will exist in the meta for at least the next week or two. So based on where I think the meta is going, I think OTK Demon Hunter is going to struggle. Also, Pull Celt was nerfed and Blade Dance was nerfed, which affects OTK Demon Hunter a little bit as well. So overall, I think OTK Demon Hunter is still a good deck, and it almost makes it onto this list, but I don't think it's quite there. But it's definitely still viable.